Counter-Terrorism Today.
You're listening to 106.2 FM IDC International Radio. I'm Itai Hanman, and this is Counter-Terrorism Today, where we have a very special initiative that we will be examining that is being conducted here at the IDC. In studio with me today, I have Mr. Daniel Cohen. He's the head of the Strategy and Intelligence Desk at the Abba Eben Institute at the IDC here in Herzliya. He's also a senior researcher at the IDC Cyber Research Center at Tel Aviv University, a counterterrorism and cyber expert for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. Daniel holds a master's in security studies from Tel Aviv University and a bachelor's in government studies from the IDC. Before joining the Abba Institute, he worked as a research fellow and coordinator at the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University and as a consultant in the government and security sectors. Mr. Daniel Cohen, how are you doing today?
I'm fine. How are you?
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. It's quite the biography. You do a lot of very interesting work, which we can get into in a little bit. But the focus of today's episode and the focus of our special interview is the Janus Initiative that is being conducted through the ICT and the Abba Eben Institute. Before we really delve into the nitty-gritty, maybe you can give us a little bit of an overview of what this initiative is and how it came to be.
Okay, so let's start with the name, the Janus Initiative, the God of Transitions. He has two faces. He has a face of war and a face of peace. He also represents a beginning and the end of a conflict. Now, we at the Abba Eben Institute believe in a proactive, innovative diplomacy. We operate where we feel that there is a need for proactive campaigns, for example, to advocate, but also to provide information, research, academic standard regarding phenomena that we feel that are not dealt enough on the international diplomacy level. And Janus Initiative is focusing on the designation process of Hezbollah in the EU, in Europe in general, but also in EU countries like France, UK, Germany, and so on.
As individuals, not as the bloc.
As a bloc in general, but also more focused on some of the countries where we feel that we can make a change. Same countries where we understand from our research that there is a lot of activity by Hezbollah terror organization. Now, in the EU, very interesting, after the Burgas terror attack, there was a change. They understood that Hezbollah is not only a political movement in Lebanon, but also a terror organization. And they decided to take further a designation process. And they decided that Hezbollah military wing will be announced as a terror organization, but they left aside the political wing of Hezbollah that can still operate very much freely in Europe.
Including finance. In the sense of raising funds or anything like that.
Exactly, raising funds when it doesn't necessarily funds for terrorism or for military purposes. Now, this was in 2013. Since then, there were a lot of changes, geopolitical changes in our region, in the Middle East. First of all, the civil war in Syria, that's a game changer. Hezbollah military militia became a real military power, needs tons of millions of dollars to support this kind of activity. Hezbollah became much bigger. That means they need more money. And that means that we felt that the circumstances have changed now, and some of the money that was raised for Hezbollah globally goes into the military wing. Hezbollah actually became huge. They have dozens of thousands of employees in Lebanon. Hezbollah's army, at least 20,000 soldiers fighting in Syria, back and forwards, of course. Not necessarily all of them are now located in Syria. A lot of new weapons that they need to support this fighting. A lot of things have changed. What we didn't see a change, we didn't see after Burgas, real terror attacks. We saw terror plots, but not successive terror attacks in Europe. But we felt that there is a place now to make a change. We understand from our research that Hezbollah is more active in places like Europe, but also other places around the world, in money laundering of drug trafficking that at least some percent of it goes into the military wing of Hezbollah, and some goes also to the political wing of Hezbollah to support the structure, the dawah, and so on. So we felt that we need to dig in-depth research, and this is exactly the Janus Initiative. Janus Initiative is a campaign, first of all. We have a documentary videos that we produced that was launched last month in Germany, in the Bundestag, where we presented it for the first time. We also have a site.
I'd like everyone, just to cut you off right there for a quick moment, it's janus-initiative.com. You can see that video that Daniel Cohen is speaking about right now.
So the site is like a capsulize our research, where we present our own findings regarding Hezbollah structure, Hezbollah terror activity, Hezbollah global engagement, and Hezbollah narco-terrorism part of the funding of the organization. You can see there's a documentary. You can see it in English. We have it also in German. We have it also on a social media account of the Janus Initiative. And what we are focusing to take further research is more in-depth of Hezbollah activity in Europe, particularly, not only global activity. So you can see there a lot of information, and I'm sure that we will gonna discuss some of it now.
I have quite a few questions, especially on all the stuff that you touched on, and like I said, that's a lot of the nitty-gritty. That's the meat of the project here, and we'll get right into that. I just want to ask you, though, before we get into, as said, the nitty-gritty, how did this project come to be? How did the initiative start, and how did all the partners that are involved in it come to be?
Okay, so I represent a program of strategy and intelligence that a key part of it is what we call diplomatic counterterrorism. Again, we have criteria where we want to run proactive campaigns and run academic standard research, policy-oriented one, and we feel that this is exactly the place to be. Because there's a vacuum in Europe that doesn't designate Hezbollah political wing, we believe that if Hezbollah political wing will be designated, we will see a change, cut of funding, first of all, to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And even if I'll take it further, utopically maybe, if Hezbollah will be fully designated in Europe, that means that a lot of their funding will cut, and that means that maybe it will assist heavily to prevent the next war in Lebanon between Israel and Lebanon, because Hezbollah will be like strangled on its financial side.
Very interesting, and that's exactly where we want to get to right now, is Hezbollah financing and how it could potentially be cut off. You made mention of the designation of the political wing. I think it's quite interesting that Hezbollah's political wing has yet to be designated in Europe. It's definitely something talked about by counterterrorism practitioners, academics, as a whole. And when looking at it, one of the main reasons we hear out of some of these European countries to not designating the political wing as a terrorist organization or part of the terrorist organization is twofold. One, you hear the cry from politicians or political entities that sit there and say, no, this is a way to engage with this group. If we fully designate them, we can't engage with them. It's important to always have engagement. They also sit in the Lebanese government, so we would like to engage on that front. The second issue you hear often is, well, if we turn against the political wing, they'll start to turn their bombs against us. One specific country, and as you mentioned, the video is in that language, is Germany. Germany has at least, according to some statistics, 1,000 Hezbollah members active right now there. What is, in your opinion, and the initiative's opinion, is preventing the European Union, more specifically Germany, from designating the rest of the organization as terrorist?
Okay, first of all, I think you mentioned most of the argument by the Germans why not to designate it. I will add only one last key ingredient by them, is that some of them see Hezbollah as stabilizing the region. Okay. Very interesting. Organizations that assassins politicians or opposition in Lebanon, and of course is taking a key part in the war in Syria, is actually stabilizing the region. We don't believe that, first of all. So this argument, I think, is the most easy to argue.
I'm doing my best to not laugh. I'm going to be very honest with you.
Now, the others are real heavy arguments but let's go them, first of all, one by one. So first of all, the argument that Hezbollah is a part of the political system in Lebanon, of course, that is true. But let's look on the political system in Lebanon these days. In the Cohen days, is there any government in Lebanon?
It's being held up by Hezbollah specifically.
It's not maybe stabilizing it, but it's stabilizing it. There's no government, and Hezbollah has a really heavy power to make it look like that because they don't want it to be more stabilized. There's a fight between two major parts, the Sunni part of El-Hariri and the Hezbollah part there, and we can understand why they are happily to keep it like it is now. And remember that they have more power now since the elections back in 2009. So this is regarding the political argument. Now, there is an argument that Europe or Germany in particular can be the negotiator in the next third war between Israel and Hezbollah, probably. Why together? We don't want to get to the third Lebanese war, and we want to prevent it before that. And to do so, Hezbollah needs to be weakened, because then they won't have the motivation to go to war, the capabilities to do so. Now, you mentioned the number in Germany. Well, the Verfassungsschutz, the German security service, published every year an annual report regarding Hezbollah in Germany. They mentioned the number of 950 operatives of Hezbollah. They also mentioned that those operatives of Hezbollah, most of them are working from hubs, like the Imam Mahdi hub in Munster, Germany. They say it's a hotbed for Hezbollah for the last 20 years, where they are like coordinating activity in Europe. Now, from our research, we understand that the numbers are much bigger. The 950 number is like a cliche even. It's like a copy-paste.
I've seen it in multiple years.
Yeah, the number doesn't change for years now. And part of our research is to prove by evidence that Hezbollah actually is much bigger, that Hezbollah is connected to Al-Quds forces, for example, of Qassam Soleimani. There's a connection in Tehran between Hezbollah and Al-Quds. And we do see plots by Al-Quds in Europe, in Germany, in France, in Belgium. We just saw it this year. There was a big plot against Mujahideen Khalaq, and there were some leaders, American figures like Rudy Giuliani, that were supposed to speak in a conference where there was nearly an assassination by the Iranians. And we believe that if Hezbollah has a structure that now deals with weapon acquisition and money laundering, the next time it can also turn into terrorism against the Europeans. So we believe the Hezbollah won't wait until there will be a full designation process, but it can happen actually at any moment because they have the structure. And this is our main research, to try to identify and understand the structure.
I think that's a very interesting point that you made mention in the finance world of Hezbollah and the fact that they money launder, looking for arms acquisitions, etc. But the one major obstacle to cutting off the funding to Hezbollah is the $700 million annually given to them by Tehran. Yeah. The European Union is currently actively trying to go around U.S. sanctions on Iran that are to prevent their nuclear program, ballistic missile, but also to cut off their ability to fund organizations like Hezbollah or fund their part in the war in Yemen, etc. Until the European Union decides to go after that financing, do you think that the designation is actually going to make a difference in their funding?
We think that the timing is now, exactly because of that reason. The finance of Iranian, again, $700 million, and a $1.1 billion budget of Hezbollah annually. Let's talk about the rest of the $400 million, okay? So we have $7 million by the Iranians that now are being strangled by sanctions. So there's a good chance, good possibility that it will decrease the funding by the Iranians. That means that the 400 millions will come from the other parts that Hezbollah gets its money from donations by the diaspora of the Shia Lebanese community. But the major part of it will be from drug trafficking and money laundering. Now, the numbers are actually, I was surprised by the numbers of that the Treasury Department and the DEA published, because for me it looked like huge numbers. We're talking about $200 million a month by a Hezbollah network back in 2011 that was revealed.
Through Project Cassandra?
Through Project Cassandra, a Iman Juma network of Lebanese origins holding Lebanese passports that are linked to Hezbollah, that work with local cartels back in the Pablo Escobar cartel, actually, back in Colombia.
So that's the Medellin cartel. And,
Exactly.
Okay.
And those guys made a fortune, and according to estimation, 20 to 25% of it goes into Hezbollah. Now, more like, let's talk about cases from previous years. There was a case.
What does Hezbollah offer these cartels that they can't do on their own, that they need to partner with Hezbollah?
Look, Hezbollah families that was spread after the civil war in the mid-70s in Lebanon are located in a very strategic points. Some of them are in places like Colombia, Brazil, and the Triangle border.
The tri-border region.
Yeah, the TBA. Other parts of families are located in Africa, mainly West and Central Africa. Places like Benin, Cameroon, Togo, Nigeria even, and also up to the northwestern side of Africa. And other parts of the family are in USA, in Germany, in France. And let's talk about the families in France and in Germany and in Netherlands and in Belgium. Now, when we analyze the DEA and the OFAC designation process of Hezbollah and sanctions from previous year, we see that a lot of them were in major cities that have ports, like Rotterdam, Antwerp, Hamburg, same places where the understanding even of the law enforcement in Europe that drugs come into Europe. We're talking mainly about cocaine. And from our understanding, there was some kind of agreement between cartels in Colombia. After the DEA was sitting on the tails for years, they had a problem of distribution of the drugs into Europe and to the USA. And the way that they found to do that was by the structure of Hezbollah. So actually Hezbollah is part of the mechanism of distribution of cocaine into Europe, doing it by local diaspora of families that immigrated after the civil war in Lebanon in the 70s. And this structure doesn't finish by the distribution process of drug trafficking, but also because of the sophistication, the hybrid terror organization that is state-sponsored, as we talked about, the Quds Force and the Iranians, they also have the capabilities to build a very complicated and sophisticated structure of money laundering. So if I give you one example, it will be the Cedar case that was part of Cassandra operation, revealed in January 16, when 50 operatives of Lebanese origin traffickers that dealt also with money laundering, that for our understanding and from the DEA report were related to Hezbollah, were arrested by raids all across Europe. We now know that some of them were key leaders in the Hezbollah money laundering structures that led into acquisition of weapons. Actually, the results of the Cedar case were on the 29th of November, and I was very surprised to see the court file saying that there's nothing to do with Hezbollah. It was only a money laundering and a drug trafficking case. The leader of the group received 7 years in prison in Paris and a fine of $500,000. But we understand from formal reports of the German Customs Service, for example, that gang was dealing with 75 million euros in 2 years, between 2014 to 2016. We understand that some of the members of this cell have direct link to Hezbollah operatives, and we believe that at least some of the money, of course a big cut went back into the cartels because they produce the drugs, but some of the money went into acquisition of weapons to support war in Syria, in Iraq also, the Hezbollah family member of in the Iraqi side, and we understand that some of it also went back into the political system in Lebanon.
So now, when you look at money laundering, the one thing that every amateur did... to wash your money, as you can inflate costs and say, oh, this got destroyed, need a new wood or whatever it be, but it's a great way to inflate costs and wash your money. What would you say are some of the legitimate businesses that Hezbollah is running right now to wash their money through? Because that's something that if we can expose, or you can expose through the Janus Initiative, what some of these legitimate companies might be, maybe people stop supporting these legitimate companies.
Okay, let's talk about the gentleman named Adam Tabaja from Beirut. This guy is a multimillionaire, has construction businesses in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Africa. He holds a couple of companies. He's a legit businessman, supposedly. But from the reports, this guy was designated. There are sanctions on his company. Why? Because actually, when we look, what we did in our project was also mapping up the global engagement and the global structure of Hezbollah. For us, it was more important to understand the hierarchy between businessmen, for example, and the real hardcore structure of Hezbollah. So what we found out, there's a connection between a couple of businessmen, like this guy, Adam Tabaja, or Qasim Tajadin, another multimillionaire that was arrested in Morocco a couple of years ago. Another guy called Bazi that was designated and sanctioned for his businesses in Belgium. Again, remember the ports issue here. And those guys actually were part of the money laundering process for Hezbollah. Adam Tabaja is a key figure in the Hezbollah system. The case study that I mentioned, one of our main case study to understand the phenomena of the Cedar case, Adam Tabaja is also involved in that. He gave orders to a guy named Muhammad Nuruddin that run all the show in Germany and other places in Europe. And this guy, again, is a legit businessman that deals with cryptocurrency businesses. Another good way, but also has used cars garage in Germany. Now, this is exactly how they do it. They buy, they get the money, receive the money from the drugs. They buy luxury cars, watches, jewelry, because in Germany it's very easy to buy that because the system in Germany actually isn't much regulation regarding the ways that you can buy with cash. You can buy a lot of stuff with a lot of cash and you don't need to report it. So it's easy to buy it, then you can ship it by again Hezbollah links by ships into Africa.
That was part of their money laundering scheme in the United States, was with the used cars, correct?
Correct, and it goes back again and again. I think you mentioned in the Politico article regarding the garage in Benin. So what we show on our documentary, by our open source research, we found out that some of the guys from the CD case that were related to this legit businessman, actually we found pictures of them in the same car garage in Benin that was mentioned in the Politico article. In the Politico article, there was like a satellite picture showing before and after when they started to buy the garage. And this is, again, a very sophisticated way because the cars afterwards are being shipped into the Gulf states where people have a lot of money and can buy Maybach, for example, for millions of dollars. And then it's easier to get the money back into Beirut and not by the European system of banks or offshore banks. You don't need to do so. This system is much easier and actually simple to do so, but it's harder to detect it and monitor it.
When Hezbollah moves its money from location to location until, let's just say, its final location is headquartered in Beirut, I have heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they like to use legitimate means to move that money. It's not just smuggled or washed and then brought in, but actually using things like Western Union and different companies like that. Now, do you believe, and does the initiative believe, that companies such as Western Union that specialize in moving money, they need to be more proactive in prevention?
We believe that it starts, first of all, on the declaration level, places like the EU, international bodies like that. Then it will be implemented on the law enforcement level. Then we will see more sanctions, more freezing of bank accounts, and so on. And then there will be a cooperation with the private companies like Western Union. But I have to say that this organization is very flexible and they adjust. I'll give you another example. There were two guys that were like couriers of Hezbollah. Back in 2015, they were arrested in Frankfurt airport with suitcase. Now, when the suitcase was opened, they found out that there's $9 million in those suitcases, and even they found crumbs of cocaine on them. Why? They use the same suitcase to carry the cocaine and also for the money. But this is not the interesting part. Afterward, it was revealed that those guys were on the route between Beirut and Frankfurt for 20 times, and even that those guys have military background, they were trained by Hezbollah in its military camps. Again, the connection between military wing of Hezbollah into other parts of Hezbollah.
It all bleeds together.
It all bleeds together. Of course, it needs to be cooperation with private companies, but again, it needs to start with putting on the table the facts, the figures, understand how it works, and then it will be easier to implement it by cooperation with private companies like Western unions and so on, that are exactly like law enforcement now are focusing on organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and it's not prioritized.
One of the facts and figures is the fact that in 2012 it was revealed that $150 million was laundered through what they are referring to as the primary money laundering concern through the Canadian Lebanese Bank. Can you give us a little bit of insight into that specific story, and how are banks being used to help launder their money?
Look, everything is connected here. The same stories that repeat and again, they're all part of this big, I will say, it was before a couple of years ago like a black hole, where there were a lot of small connections that the DEA started with its task force to connect the dots. And the Canadian bank is exactly the example for that. What was started with banks that are operating from Lebanon, for example, where it's easier to launder the money. Today, after the story of the Lebanese bank, this affair made it harder to work through legit banks to do so. And this is exactly the way to assist the support to stop this kind of mechanism by regulation, by working closely with banks. But I have to tell that in Germany, for example, there was a reorganized of the unit that deals with money laundering by banks. So last year they opened a new unit called, it was taken by the Customs Service. It's called the Financial Intelligence Unit. And they have the authority to investigate into bank accounts and see if there is any anomaly or money laundering process. What is the problem? It's not a problem of approaching or working with the banks. The problem is that there's no connection between the units that deal with this kind of activity. Narco-terrorism is very, very unique. It's different from a regular crime scene, and it's different from counter-terrorism. It's something in between. It's hybrid. What I mean is that if you want to really support the fight against narco-terrorism like Hezbollah is doing, you need to find a way to fuse information between the example that I gave of financial intelligence units that have the authority to work towards banks, but you also need to share information with counter-terrorism units, or let's call it security services, and also with the police side of law enforcement or drug agencies. Then you will start to build the full picture, and then it will be easier to work towards also banks. But I have to say that most of the banks that I'm familiar with were banks that were part of money laundering process in places like Beirut, and less by European banks.
Fair enough. And when I look at Hezbollah, and we continue in our discussion here, you've made mention several times about the necessity of designation. You go to the website, again, it speaks about the necessity for designation. As you said, top-down approach, first designate, and then the other pieces can fall into place. Recently, Israel has undertaken Operation Northern Shield, where they are exposing Hezbollah tunnels that are entering Israel from Lebanese territory under the ground. We have uncovered thus far 4 tunnels to the best of our knowledge currently. When looking at that, the way Israel has presented it to the world as a whole, you see the involvement of UNIFIL, you see how Israel has called on Secretary Pompeo from the United States to present information. They are flying to Russia and presenting information. In your opinion, does an expose like this, where Hezbollah intentions are clearly exposed, violating the sovereignty, violating UN Resolution 1701, is that going to have an effect on the Europeans when it comes to designation?
Great question. We do believe not only top-down but also bottom-up approach, first of all. But we decided that our main focus will be on activity in Europe, unless in our region. Why? Because we don't believe that, Israel is for years now trying to present what's happening in our northern border, the violations that you mentioned, and so on. We didn't see so much effect regarding it. Now, if in the same time we have this like a silent killer of drug trafficking that kills youth in Germany or in France and other parts of Europe, and also that money goes into weapons that bounce back to us on our northern border, we believe this is much effective because this is happening in their backyard, not in our backyard or in our northern border. From our roadshow so far, we spoke with politicians, with actually key politicians that deal with that matter in Europe, with journalists, with law enforcement professionals. We believe that this approach can be effective because in the end of the day, the government there affected by, first of all, from the public, and I don't believe that the public wants to see any activity of terrorism happening in their backyard, especially if it has to do also with the element of drugs. Actually, it took us time to adjust to that understanding. We believe that nothing will change it if we keep returning with the narrative that this is a threat to Israel. And we do see that it has to be with activity in Europe if we want to make a change.
Fair enough. And speaking of Europe, the European Union is quite a diverse set of countries. We have spoken specifically about Western European countries right now. We have seen a different approach by Eastern European countries in general terms when it comes to dealing with terrorism, counter-terrorism, the immigration process from the Syrian fallout of their civil war. And when you look at it, do you find it easier or more difficult for the initiative to try to engage on an individual level with some of these countries? Let's say go to the Czech Republic and try to get Czech Republic to designate Hezbollah on its end before approaching the EU as a whole, when there's much more influence from France and Germany, who seem reluctant to want to designate Hezbollah fully as a terrorist organization.
Look, I think that those countries were affected by the refugee crisis, for example. As other countries, the priorities now is that, and not necessarily organizations like Hezbollah. But if you mention the Czech Republic, let's talk about the Eli Fayyad affair.
Please do.
Eli Fayyad was a weapon dealer, a Lebanese origin, a consultant of Nasrallah himself, that was based in Ukraine. Now, this guy was arrested in 2014 in Prague by DEA covered agents that were pretending to be part of the FARC, the Colombian militia. And they arrested him and they passed him into the Czech authorities. What happened next is very interesting. Same time, there was a Czech father that his son immigrated into Raqqa to fight for ISIS, and he was accompanied by a Secret Service agent of the Czech government, as a family member, as a lawyer. And this guy, same time that Ali Fayyad, the drug dealer that works for Hezbollah, was arrested in the Czech Republic, same time those guys were kidnapped in Beirut. And even that the American wanted to extort Ali Fayyad back into the USA for trial, for crimes against Americans, because he's part of a terror organization, after negotiation of a couple of months, he was released by the Czechs and returned safely back home into Beirut. And those guys were also released, the Czech guys, the citizens in Beirut.
That's the modus operandi, though, for Hezbollah. In the past, they have kidnapped Europeans in exchange for their people in European jails. So
exactly, this wasn't the same time. There are other countries like the Bulgarians where there was a terror attack that is linked to Hezbollah, where the trial is happening right now, also Cyprus and so on. But we like challenges. We understood that if we really want to make an effort and to make a change in Europe, especially in places where we know there's much more activity of Hezbollah, it will be in places like Germany, France, UK. This is a challenge, but we believe they have the willpower to make the change. If they will decide to focus on that issue, prioritize it, then we will see a change. Actually, in UK, there is a talk now, a debate at least, in the parliament regarding the full designation of Hezbollah. The UK only designated a small part of Hezbollah called the External Security Unit of Hezbollah, what Imad Monier was the head of it, and Talal Hamia is now. This is like the really small part of the military wing of Hezbollah. In France and in Germany, we don't see even that. There's no any kind of designation process, but in the Netherlands, for example, there's a full designation process. So yes, there's a diversity between the European countries, but we believe that if we want to make a change, we need to focus on the big countries that lead the EU and not on the smaller countries. Because we believe, first of all, on the broader look, we need to make the change in the EU first.
Something that's mentioned on your guys' website, and before we wrap up our very enlightening conversation here, I'd like to, I guess, point it out because it is on the website, and it's really talking about Hezbollah as a global threat. And we focused on Europe in this conversation, and rightfully so, as that is a lot of where their activity is. We spoke about the tri-border region with their nexus with the drug cartels in Southern America. One thing that we really haven't looked at, though, is their Asian connections. One thing we have seen in the past is in Thailand, Hezbollah has been operating. And how does that affect the rest of the initiative, knowing that, okay, we're focusing, or you're focusing currently on the European initiative, but major Muslim countries in Southeast Asia exist. Hezbollah is very prominent in some of these Asian countries. And does that have ramifications how you deal with Europe, simultaneously deal with Asia, or is that completely separate issues?
Everything is connected. It's not separated. For now, our goal is to make the change in Europe, and we understand that this is only a part of it. It's a small wing. It's not the total full bounty of total designation of Hezbollah. Even the examples that you mentioned of Thailand, this is only part of a bigger cell that some of it was arrested in the United States in New York after plotting against Jewish and Israeli targets. So again, everything links, but if you cut the chain of supply at one part of it, we believe there will be a big change. For now, the big money that Hezbollah receives from money laundering is from Europe. For us, we believe it's a better way to attack, to strangle the finance system of Hezbollah. But of course, it will affect also other parts or global parts, Asian parts that Hezbollah is activated over there. But remember that we are only part of a much bigger picture. There are security forces that are oriented to prevent those kind of terror attacks. And we're dealing with a diplomatic effort. Because of that, we're going into the international bodies, designation, and so on. But we understood that we need to present facts if we want to go to that angle.
One thing you made mention of as well is the way Hezbollah has the ability to evolve, if you will, transform its needs based on counter Hezbollah operations by security services, diplomatic initiatives. If you were to cut the head off the snake, if you will, in the European sector, where their funding comes from, how do you think, or what would you predict is their next evolution to their funding if they were to lose such a great source out of Europe?
They will still have their structure in places like in Africa or other places. But if we're looking on the narco-terrorism element, it's consuming of drugs in the end of the day. We need to look on statistics where people consume drugs and see if there will be any kind of effect, if it will be cut in places like in Europe. Of course, Asia can be one example for that. But we do believe that it will harm them for years if something like that will happen. They will lose tons of millions of dollars if there will be any change in the EU, not on the declaration or the implementation level. The next step, there is a chance that we will see them attempting to go to something completely different. For example, cybersecurity issues. Even now, we see them. We believe that they have also anonymity platforms and dark web use and so on to continue this kind of efforts. What will be the next chance to fund money? Probably they will start with donation campaigns. We will see more false charities like we saw in Europe in the last couple of years, can happen all around the world. we need to focus wherever there is a Lebanese Shia diaspora community. Probably from there we will see the next, revolving of Hezbollah if there will be any kind of stop in Europe.
Before we wrap up here and direct all of our listeners to where they can go and view all this wonderful information, what would you say is the number one threat that Hezbollah poses to global security?
I will say that the Hezbollah connection with the Iranians acting as a proxy. We mentioned a couple of plots by Hezbollah, but also plots by the Al-Quds forces or the Iranian military unit forces around the world. I do believe that narco-terrorism is only one part of it to finance it, but Hezbollah is well structured all around the world. And I do believe that we need to focus on Hezbollah also as a terror threat and to counter that, because they have the tools to do so. For now, until the sanctions, they didn't have the motivation, but there's a good chance that the Iranian will use Hezbollah as a proxy for terror plots, and we need to be prepared for that also.
The Janus Initiative, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about where people can go to find all this wonderful information of the Janus Initiative.
Okay, so we have a website called janusinitiative.com. So go into there and start to read all of the articles. This is an international platform with information that is very dynamic because we add in a lot of layers by time. So for now, you can go into there, you can see the full movie, you can see parts of the movie, like I'm more focusing on some of the issues that we mentioned here today in our discussion. And also read a lot of interesting articles regarding Hezbollah global activity. We also have a Facebook page called with the same name, Janus Initiative. And let's keep forward for our publications that will probably be released by IDC platforms, by our own site, but also in journals and in media.
Who are the partners for the Janus Initiative? Make sure we mention everybody.
Yeah, the main partner is ICT here in the IDC. ICT are working for years now on Hezbollah research, led by Professor Ganor and by Dr. Azani and their team. So we have very close ties with those guys, and they are like a full part of this initiative. We also have collaborations with all kinds of international organizations in Europe, also in the USA. You can see also a couple of experts that are the leading expert to Hezbollah that will be presented on our documentary. People like Dr. Matt Levitt or Derek Mertz, that was heading of the special units of the DEA for a couple of years. You can see them on the movie. That's it. So if you want to join it, feel free to contact us and we'll be happy to do so.
Very much so. And this was a very enlightening conversation. Thank you so much, Daniel Cohen, who is the head of the Strategy and Intelligence Desk at the Abba Eben Institute at the IDC, also senior researcher in the Interdisciplinary Cyber Research Center at Tel Aviv University, and a counterterrorism and cyber expert for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Mr. Daniel Cohen, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate the conversation.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for hosting me.